Testing 1, 2. Good evening, good evening, good evening. Everybody get some good stuff to eat? If you didn't get any good stuff to eat, that's your own fault. You realize if there's any good stuff left, I'm going to eat it when I get done. So, okay, we're using the Explore the Bible, as you see here on the screen, Explore the Bible the summer edition 2021, which it goes through the book of Job and Ecclesiastes. We just finished up with the book of Job, or Job, however you want to look at it. What am I hearing playing besides? Good evening, good evening, good evening. Everybody get some good stuff. Somebody's got their phone on Facebook or somewhere. If you didn't get any good stuff to eat, that's your own fault. Realize if there's any good stuff left, I'm going to eat it when I get done. So, okay, we're in the. Somebody's got their phone on Facebook or something because it's repeating. No? As you see here on the screen, Explore the Bible the summer edition 2021, which goes through the book of Job and Ecclesiastes. We just finished up with the book of Job. Do what? Is it up here somewhere? Somebody's got their phone on Facebook or somewhere. Somebody's got their phone on Facebook or something because it's repeating. It's coming through that up there. I know.
Electronics are taking over.
Do what? Is it up here somewhere? Yeah, it's coming through this speaker up here. It's coming through that up there. I know. Okay, you don't get a PowerPoint tonight. Okay. Now I know next time check that speaker before we start going crazy with it. So I didn't even think about having a speaker in that LCD projector. But anyway, we're using this Explore the Bible, the summer edition, 2021. We just finished up in the book of Job, and we're getting ready to go to the book of Ecclesiastes. Let me turn this light on now. I apologize for that. I'll get that fixed next time. I did it a different way. I went using a VGA connection last time. This time I used an HDMI, and obviously the volume's coming, or it's coming through the speakers. Okay, so we're in the book of Ecclesiastes, the lesson entitled, What's the Use? What's the use? The summary statement for this particular study this evening is the wise person seeks to find meaning in life from God. A wise person seeks to find meaning in life from God. You're going to be in the book of Ecclesiastes, obviously, like I said. We're using the Christian Bible, Christian Standard Bible, in this quarterly. Let me ask you a question. Before we get started, share everything that you know or remember from your studies in the book of Ecclesiastes before tonight. What do you know about the book of Ecclesiastes? Solomon wrote it, they feel.
The wisest man that ever lived.
The wisest man that ever lived.
Everything is meaningless.
Do what now?
Don't work your whole life to give it to somebody else.
Don't work your whole life to give to somebody else. Okay.
Life is meaningless
Life is meaningless.
under the sun as you win without the sun, S-O-N.
Okay. What else? What's probably there's two words that gets used a lot throughout the book of Solomon. What was it?
Meaningless.
Okay, meaningless, and then the other one's under the sun. What's under the sun when he used the context there? Under the sun. Okay, living here on the planet. Okay, so now we get all the background. They believe Solomon wrote this, as you've heard me say on Sunday morning when I've done a sermon on it. They believe Solomon's writing this toward the end of his life. By this time, he's reflecting back on his life. He's kind of looking back over the years, reflecting how things has transpired for him. We know, as we said so far, he was the wisest, the richest man in the world. We also know that he liked his ladies, over 1,000 women, 700 he married, and 300 concubines. A lot of the marriages were arranged because of him being king, that he would marry someone, Egypt's daughter, someone from Egypt's daughter, whatever it usually do for government reasons, you want to say it, or political reasons. But even so, when you go on the first Kings and look at his life, eventually those ladies led him away from his Lord, and it was eventually his downfall. Of course, we know that God never intended for anyone to have more than one man, one wife, one lifetime. Okay? So that's kind of the context. What's the use? He begins. We're going to begin in Ecclesiastes chapter 1. The first major point there we're going to look at is a limited perspective. In other words, we're going to look back now with Solomon at his limited perspective. Ecclesiastes chapter 12. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, starting at verse 12. Okay? And it says there in God's Word, I, the teacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. Now, like I think was Heather said earlier, that gives you an indication of who he is right off the bat here in this verse. And in the opening ones too, it says that they believe it's Solomon. Many of the commentaries I read, there was all kinds of debates about that it wasn't Solomon. They listed unknown authors and so on. Other than we know the ultimate author of the text is God. Okay? But now, in this passage, he begins and he identifies himself, but then he said, he starts with his experiment, just like almost like a scientist or someone setting out to give a conclusion or give an analogy. He says in verse 13, I applied my mind to examine and explore through wisdom all that is done under heaven. God has given people this miserable task to keep them occupied. Verse 14, I have seen all the things that are done under the sun and have found everything to be futile, a pursuit of the wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. Okay? So going through there, give me your feelings. When you read those verses and you're reading them, if you read it just like a letter that you're sitting down and reading, reading that, how would you feel? What's your emotional state? Well, how does he make you feel? Very depressed. Do what was it, Errol? Everything is futile. Remember that famous word that Heather? Yes, Heather said that it said that and I'll read this since I didn't do the PowerPoint. You don't see it on the screen. Said at the issue ultimately in reading Ecclesiastes is to come to terms with the frequently used and very important word vanity, as you saw in the NRSV, or meaningless in the NIV, or futility in the NJB, which occurs, and I want you to hear this, which occurs 37 times in this book, out of 73 total times in the Old Testament. Okay, 37 of those 73 was right here in his book. Okay, the word itself means vapor, or breath, or whisper of air. So you kind of get the idea that, just like we said, he doesn't have too much to say about life so far, does he? Now, he gives us the analogy right off the bat because he used the phrase there in 1:3. He said, under the sun, which Solomon's way of referring to life on earth. And it is here the teacher often asks, listen to this, it is here the teacher often asks the question of the book, what does a person gain from all of his efforts that he has labored at under the sun? And obviously the answer is futility, or meaningless, or depending on which version and which way that's translated. Okay? But he says something about God there too. What does he give a clue in those verses about God and human knowledge? There's a little bitty parable, a little bitty story that he uses. Look at verse 15. What's he saying there? He's saying some things just can't be explained. Some things just can't, it doesn't make sense. You know, when we're dealing with God and we're dealing with an omnipotent God, you know, some things just in life just doesn't have a conclusion. You know, like he said, he's researched as we go through the book, all 12 chapters eventually with him. You know, ultimately comes to the conclusion in chapter 12 where he said, you know, fear God is the key to wisdom. But in the meantime, before he gets there, he goes through all of this stuff. He, you know, looks at material wealth, he looks at all this, and he comes to this conclusion here, said, there's just some things I can't explain to you about God. You kind of recognize some of the wisdom here from another book we may have looked at earlier? Job. Job came up with the kind of the same, Job's friends, and Job came up with the same kind of thought. There's just some things we just don't know about God that we just can't answer. There's not an answer that we can give when we look at God. So we have a limited perspective from a human, from looking under the sun, as he says, looking at just strictly the earth without God being involved in it. If we look out over it, there's just some things we just can't explain. Those don't make sense. So he says here in your guys' quarterly, he says, Ecclesiastes teaches us not to depend on ourselves and our resources. Ecclesiastes teaches us not to depend on ourselves or our resources. So who are we going to depend on? God. God. And that's who we need to ultimately keep our focus on. You know, as we went through the book of Job, we came to that same conclusion all the way through there too. Okay? So what else? And then he gives us a lesson too. He says in Ecclesiastes 1:18, he talks about, you know, the more knowledge that I get, the more depressed I get. And he comes up and he says, it's better just to be stupid. And I use my kind of vernacular. That's not necessarily the way that the Bible obviously put it, but it's kind of the context he's speaking of. He looks at a fool and he said, well, you know, I'm no better off than a fool. Because then he talks about, you know, with us, think about this, people, 24-hour a day news. Every flavor of every type of talking heads you want to listen to, you can find. Every propaganda, everything you want to listen about the virus, the vaccine, the president, everything you want to know about this country, just listen to one of the talking heads, they've got the answer. But now if you listen to that 24-hour day, some of the people that I know, that I got friends on Facebook, they listen to so much of that, they live in this world of fear.
I think Job had Facebook.
You think both Job had Facebook? He had the biblical version of Facebook, huh? But think about how depressing that can make us, though, Phil. If you think about it, I mean, if you keep, you heard the old computer analogy: garbage in, garbage out. You know, you keep pouring that stuff in you, keep pouring your stuff in you. Man alive, you just after a while, it's like all you want to do is just, you know, get a heating pad and curl up and drink a cup of coffee and never leave your room, and never go nowhere. Which is no existence whatsoever. Okay, so he asked this question. He says, why is searching for ultimate meaning using only a natural perspective, in other words, limited knowledge and earthly resources, futile? Why is searching for ultimate meaning using only natural perspective, in other words, limited knowledge and earthly resources, futile? He didn't have the instructions manual. The instructions. Right. Now remember too, we have something over in Job. We have something on Job and Ecclesiastes that they didn't have. We have Jesus. So when you look at the book of Ecclesiastes, King Solomon's dealing with the ultimate problem, death. Because eventually he starts looking at that very thing. In his world, there is death. There is the analogy of the grave. But there's not much yet that he knows about the resurrection. He doesn't have that hope. The only thing he sees is once you die, it's it. You're dead, now you're worm food. So he doesn't have the analogy that we have. So when you look at that, his perspective is a lot more limited even than our perspective is, because at least we have the hope and the assurance of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Okay? So, thoughts?
Didn't they know at that time that God was going to send him a Savior?
They had, like you said, they had limited knowledge. They had limited knowledge because by then, I try to remember as far as historical, when was Ecclesiastes written versus, the prophet Isaiah and some of the prophets. Depending on when it was authored, if you want to say it, when God chose use the human author to write it, that would be the answer, to know for sure. What kind of knowledge did they have? Even did the prophets at this point in time that he had the knowledge of Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel or something like that, So that would be the question. Any other thoughts? Okay. So we got that limited perspective as King Solomon speaks of. And then he goes on to the next major point, inheritance blown. An inheritance blown. Ecclesiastes chapter 2 now, verses 18 through 21. Now before we go there, I want you to do me a little favor. Let's go to the book of Genesis all the way to the very beginning. In the beginning. Chapter 1. There you go. In the beginning. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Now, by this time, we went through the creative process. We're in day 6 of the creation process. Okay? So, as you read Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, it says there, and I'm reading the NIV, then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule, once you hear that word, that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. Verse 27. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. Verse 28. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Verse 29. Then God said, I give to you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. In other words, we were vegetarians until the flood. Okay? Which really probably tells you what we should be today. Get away from the meat and all that stuff. Verse 30. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life, nephesh, the Hebrew word, in it I give every green plant for food, and it was so. Now what I want you to see is verse 31. God saw all that he had made, and it was what? Okay. What was work like here? What was work like? Described here, what was work like? Physical work like? Farmers. Okay.
Taking care of the garden.
Okay. Okay.
Animals.
Okay, taking care of the garden.
Well, it was easy work compared to what God had given them, though.
Right.
They didn't have to toil and labor like we have to today.
No. It's pleasurable work is the point I'm trying to get at. It's God ordained work. It's pleasurable work. It's what God intended when you look at work and just go ahead. I'm sorry.
He enjoyed making the earth.
Okay. Okay.
And us.
And us too. So now, go to chapter 3.
Genesis?
Yep, Genesis chapter 3. Keep going down to Genesis 3. Let me get down to, verse 16 of chapter 3. Then the woman, he said, by this time they've disobeyed God and they've fell in the garden. Okay, this is the pronouncement. This is their judgment. Then to the woman he said, verse 16 of chapter 3, using the NIV, I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. This is the first time that you mention of the women's liberation movement. Right here, okay? Those words just bring chills. Your desire will be for your husband, he will rule over you, okay? Verse 17. To Adam he said, because you have listened to your wife. Did you hear that, guys? Because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed, I want you to see this. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. Verse 19, by the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to the dust you will return. Okay? What changed now? Now it's a different kind of work, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's painful toil. It's work that's, it's
You have to look at it.
right.
Weeds now.
Yeah, we got the weeds, we got all the problems, everything don't perfectly grow anymore. We've got all these issues of life now, which I'm going to deal with Sunday in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, where he talks about the ebb and flows of life. There's a time to die and a time to live, all these kind of flows, these natural flows of life that we just go through. I mean, it's just part of what we do because we're here, we're alive and we're on this planet, basically is the way you look at it. So that big change, that one change, changed the way work is for us. Now, work's still good. Work is still necessary. Work is how we pay our bills. Work is how we feed ourselves. But sometimes it's not as pleasurable as what God intended it, right? Sometimes it's work. Okay, now let's get back. Go all the way back to Ecclesiastes now. I want you to see that because I want you to see the inheritance that we blew. What was the inheritance that was blown? Okay. Yeah, perfect world, a perfect world. Sin changed everything. Verse 18 of chapter 2 now of the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 18. I hated all my work that I labored at under the sun because I must leave it to the one who comes after me. Did you see that? And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Yet he will take over all my work that I labored at, skillfully under the sun. This too is futile. Verse 20. So I began to give myself over to despair concerning all my work that I had labored at under the sun. Verse 21. When there is a person whose work was done with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, he must give his portion to a person who has not worked for it. This too is futile and a great wrong. What did Solomon feel about inheritance?
It doesn't matter, somebody's going to take over. It's not going with him.
It's not going with him. I think you heard me, it was this past Sunday or one of the Sundays that said when I was working part-time funeral home, there wasn't one time that Dana hooked up a U-Haul truck to the back of the hearse as he pulled out from the funeral home. So now think about it. The Egyptians buried mummies. They buried great kings with their material wealth, thinking that when they pass over to the valley of the dead, they would, they'll take their treasures with them. So there was that theology or that belief, that maybe you can take some of this stuff with you. Well, Solomon kind of come to the conclusion, because he's using the analogy that there's not nothing. Boy, my English teacher loved that. There's his theology is there's you're dead, you're dead. So if you leave it, then everybody in the world is going to abuse it. Now, if you go into 1 Kings and you look at Solomon's life, when he gets toward the end, when he dies, look at his son Rehoboam. He basically destroys the kingdom. Everything his daddy built, he kind of destroyed. King Solomon, probably looking at his kids and he thought that, The saddest things I think I've seen is when I helped Dana, again, working at the funeral home and see families fighting over some of the dumbest stuff. I mean, families that usually are pretty, and we're always good people, see around town, stuff like that. Man, when someone died, if there was money involved, man, it got nasty. So, now I'll tell you something. I want to tell you something on my grandmother, my grandmother. When my grandmother died, she left me the inheritance, and she didn't give it to my mom. My dad had passed away by then, so she left me her inheritance. And she told me before she died she was going to do it. She said, the reason why I ain't giving it to your mom, she says, your mom don't know how to manage money. So my poor mother this day, I harass her about that. So, see, I told you, Mom. But anyway, Solomon's got the idea here. He's seeing inheritance blown. It's like, I worked all this life and, put all this work in and sweat and tears, and I'm going to leave it for somebody else. Okay, so he didn't have much ideas for that, did he? Okay, let's go on. Verse 22. So now enjoy your work. Enjoy your work. Verse 22 of chapter 2. What does a person get with all of his work and all of his effort that he labors at under the sun? The question, rhetorical question. Verse 23. For all of his days are filled with grief, and his occupation is sorrowful. Even at night his mind does not rest. This too is futile. How many of us go to bed like, oh gosh, what I got to do tomorrow? You know. Yes. Nobody ever does that, do you? You instantly fall asleep when you lay your head on a pillow at night, right? Never worry about nothing, never concerns, never. You don't run over the life's event of the day. That little lady over there does. It takes her hours to fall asleep. He makes a point here. It's kind of interesting. He said, we cannot make the mistake of making a good thing the ultimate thing. Did you hear what I said? We cannot make the mistake of making a good thing the ultimate thing. Now think about that. Is that bad? We cannot make the mistake of making a good thing the ultimate thing. Okay. Give us an example, Della.
Well, I mean, if you base everything on the Lord, that's the best thing ever.
Okay. Base everything on the Lord? Okay. Right. I wrote here in my notes, stewardship, not possessions. We need to look at everything that God gives us as we're stewards over it. It doesn't belong to us. The problem we run into is when we turn it into our possessions. Mine. More. That's true. Have you ever heard that Howard Hughes was asked one time how much money is enough? And he said just a little bit more. And he was the richest man known, at the time. Seriously, they asked him that, and he said just a little bit more. He's already a billionaire probably at the time. So there's just a little bit more, So if you do that, you keep proper perspective on your possessions. They don't necessarily become, a good prime example, someone becoming an alcoholic. Not an alcoholic, a workaholic is what I meant to say, workaholic. What's the difference between working and a workaholic?
Workaholic, that's all he ever does is work.
Okay.
He doesn't think of anything else except work.
Okay. That becomes his goal, becomes his life, becomes his God. Everything around him all revolves around that job. And usually someone like that, when they lose a job, is one who's devastated the most. Someone that's had that. It's great to have a job, and thank God that we had them. Some of us would look around the room, or like me, the 30 years I put in the fire department, 20 plus years in the military, 20 plus years in the ministry now, believe it or not, that, God's blessed me. I know, I know. My kids, do I, honey? Yeah, you're right, Della. I had 2 jobs at one time because the military. Yeah. Yeah, because I was in the Air Force Reserve, so that. Yeah, there you go. I was in the Air Force Reserve when I was on the fire department, so I did both of those, and then I retired from the Air Force Reserves and the fire department and went into the ministry. So, but what I was saying is, God blessed every time He's blessed. Because when I came out of the military and got on the fire department, I never even wanted a job. I was, living on unemployment at the time. Just got out of the military, living the high life, I thought, and I just walked into the fire department job. So like God was taking care of me, and I didn't even realize it. Okay, so much for me. What thoughts? Any thoughts? You guys got any thoughts you want to add here?
I was thinking how Solomon was saying all this. He didn't realize his dad wrote a psalm that said, this is the day that the Lord has made.
Mm-hmm.
Rejoice and be glad in it.
Amen. Yeah. And one of my favorite songs, of course, Solomon didn't have this song, Count Your Blessings. Yeah, name them one by one. That's a good way to keep a stewardship in mind, in your head, okay? So enjoyed work. Let's go on. Let's finish up these verses and wrap this up this evening. Okay, verse 24 now of chapter 2. Enjoyed work, your last major point. There is nothing better for a person than to eat, drink, and enjoy his work. In other words, that's where you talk about stewardship, okay? There's nothing better. Now, notice this is probably one of the most positive things he said so far. There's nothing better for a person than to eat, drink, and enjoy his work. I have seen even this from God's hand. Okay? Verse 25. Because who can eat and who can enjoy life apart from who? God. So even though he's not made the final judgment and give you the end of the story as he shares in chapter 12 where he says fearing God, here he starts giving you a little bit of hint. He knows what he wants you to know, meaning because who can eat and who can enjoy life apart from him, meaning God. Verse 26. For to the person who is pleasing in his sight, he gives wisdom and knowledge. Now, this is godly wisdom. What's the difference between godly wisdom and man's wisdom?
Well, man's wisdom is nothing compared to God.
Okay. Now, how do we know God's wisdom? Us, today. Ask him for it. James says ask him for it and he'll give it to us. You know, wisdom in this context is godly wisdom. It's wisdom that you use the Bible to make application to your life and live your life by that. The more you live godly wisdom, the stronger you get in your faith and so on and so forth. Okay? So God's wisdom is godly wisdom, meaning it's Bible wisdom. It's what you're learning there, your application and how you apply it to your life. Okay? He gives wisdom, knowledge, and joy. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and accumulating in order to give to the one who is pleasing in God's sight. This too is futile and a pursuit of the wind. Now wait a minute. What was that? But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and accumulating in order to give to the one who is pleasing in God's sight. This too is futile. Well, he just said that, what? Let the evil work because they're going to give me money. Is that what he said? Again, this is one of those limited things of Solomon. He's basing on eventually that when God brings the ultimate judgment, we win in the end. The good guys win in the end. So you get to Revelation 21 and 22, Revelation 21 and 22, the new heaven and the new earth. You know, Jesus comes back, the whole story there. The ultimate conclusion to this is the bad loses, the evil loses, and the good wins. That's what he's saying here. So, okay. Any thoughts? Okay, Solomon's words apply to our lives today as we look for meaning in our lives. Solomon's words apply to our lives today as we look for meaning in our lives. The wise person seeks to find meaning in life from God and to exhibit joy in his or her everyday life. Okay, so next week, what time is it? Guess what chapter we're going to be in next week? What time is it? Yep, you'll get a little bit of a taste of it this Sunday because I'm going to do a sermon out of that text this Sunday. Okay, give you a little bit of a clue. Okay, let me turn this Facebook thing off and we'll have our prayer requests. Anybody that may be watching us in all of our streaming services, if you have a praise or Thanksgiving, you want to pass it on, we'll pick it up off of Facebook, or a prayer request or a need or whatever. If you happen to be in the Naples area, come and visit us